Hi, everybody. Today I was going to show a little bit to everybody about a part of our family tree that we don't know much about, but is still very extremely fascinating and uh, is an amazing insight into uh, our experience in the Revolutionary War and a lot more. So, without further ado, I was going to introduce you to our connection to the Austin family, which is the same Austin family that Stephen Fuller Austin, who founded Texas, is from, with making him a distant cousin of ours, very distant. Um, uh, yeah, so let me get started. So to start with, let's start with Grandpa Donald Wallace Connor, whose father, Francis Wallace Connor, his mother, Catherine Mary Joanna Pigeon, is from Canada. She was from Canada, moved to Michigan, and then moved to New Hampshire with her husband, Peter Connor, and that's where they started their family. That's where Francis Connor's from, and etc. Okay, so the question is, how did she get to Canada? Well, we don't know much about her father, but her mother, Charlotte Hines, uh, was the child of Moses Smith Hines and Joanna Austin. And here's where the Austin branch kicks in. Um, who Moses was from Vermont, but Joanna was from Canada, as was her father and her grandfather, Solomon Austin. And this is where I'm going to kick things in. I'm going to tell you today about Solomon Austin, who was born in North Carolina. If I can show you quick. I'm sorry, he's born in Maryland. He lived in North Carolina until the end of the Revolutionary War, after which he and his family and some other families with him all moved to the newly created province of Ontario in 1793 and built their family there, built a life there, and became a huge pillar in the early Ontario community. So much so that I actually have a book of Ontario history, pioneer sketches of Long Point Settlement, 1898, which is a staple of Ontario history, making it relatively easy to get on the used book market, and has a large sketch about his life, which I was going to read excerpts from to you. The first thing I want to point out is this acronym after his name, UE. I don't know if you know, I didn't know what that stands for. Stands for Unified Empire. It was a title given to British loyalists who left the country of America after the Revolution and moved to Canada out of loyalty to the British Crown, to give you an understanding of where he's coming from. Yeah, so that's pretty fascinating. So to summarize his relationship to us, I just want to pull that up quick. Oops, click the relationship. And you can see the tree going back. And the summary is he's my sixth great grandfather. So some of yours fifth great grandfather. So he is our direct line. Yeah. So having given that quick summary, I feel like this book is a much better explanation of his life than mine would be to give. So I was just going to read from it, some excerpts. Again, I'm going to read from the physical copy, but I have it up here as a PDF, and I'll share that with you guys so that you can read it as well. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to leave out genealogy stuff and some other, we'll say, pro-Canada diatribes. But it's all fascinating, and I recommend looking through it. Yeah. So with that, let me start. So his sketch is called A Pioneer Who Lived in the Executive Log Mansion, the Austin Family. So starting at the part where we describe him. Solomon Austin was one of our prominent old foundation builders. His family came to Upper Canada with a party of UE loyalists consisting of 12 families. They came from Maryland and North Carolina and arrived on the Niagara frontier as early as 1793. The Austins came from Orange County, North Carolina, and previous to the War of the Revolution, all had comfortable homes and kind neighbors. But the terrible result of that war made them homeless and despised aliens in the land that gave many of them birth. So that's the start of the context. I forgot to mention, but I do want to point out there's a fascinating mystery at the end of this, which I will leave as an open question. I have my suspicions about what happened, but genuinely fascinating. So hold on for that. Okay. It is said, so going back, it is said that shortly after the new province was organized, these 12 families clubbed together and sent one of their number to the new country to learn what were the natural advantages of settlement and the inducements offered settlers by way of land grants, etc. The name of this trusted emissary was John Davis, who subsequently settled in Windham, a little north of Simcoe. Later on, his brother came from North Carolina and settled near him. He reported favorably, and in due time, the party was en route for the new country. They came in canvas-covered wagons, bringing their household effects and a number of cows and other farm stock with them. Buffalo at this time was a small village containing about a dozen houses. The party crossed the river at Old Niagara and remained there a short time. In common with most of their fellow loyalists, they came into the forests of Upper Canada with little or no means. Governor Simcoe offered his executive log mansion at Newark to Solomon Austin as a temporary shelter for his family until he could locate his land. He was awarded 600 acres for himself and his wife, and 200 acres for each of his children to be selected by themselves from any of the untaken lands, which at that time included pretty much the entire province. But why did Governor Simcoe show Solomon Austin so much kindness? Sir John Graves Simcoe had fought England's battles in the War of the Revolution and was a UE loyalist himself. He had been an officer, and Mr. Austin had been a private in his command, and had distinguished himself at some minor engagement, and his old general had not forgotten it. Hence the extra favors shown him and his family when they arrived in the new country. So not only was our grandfather a loyalist, he actively fought for the British under the future governor of Ontario, John Simcoe, apparently admirably enough to be given privileged status when he got to the province. So he was actually pretty, you might say on the wrong side, but pretty well known on it, right? He was pretty distinguished. Mr. Austin was accompanied by his son Solomon Jr. They're Solomon Sr., Solomon Jr. When he made his tour of inspection in view of locating his lands. They had lived on high lychee lands in North Carolina, and they made up their minds to locate their new lands in some pleasant valley where the droughts would not trouble them as of yore. So this, by the way, this is going to be like pioneer stories. So this part is it's interesting for that part, but also like the point is like he's doing his best to find the best, most economically profitable lands. So it's kind of interesting for that way. Furthermore, they had resolved to build a mill, and this also made a choice of valley lands necessary in order to secure the required water power privileges. They traveled through the forest on foot and held a conference with Chief Brant at Brantford, and Chief Brant was a famous, Canadian Indian chief who fought with the British as well. And yeah, there's a lot written about him if you're interested. And the chief pointed out a southerly course towards the Big Lake. They proceeded according to Brant's directions, and in due time came to a stream which they followed to the lake. This was Patterson's Creek, and the place where they came upon it was near the spot where the old home of Elder Steinhoff, I don't know who that is, was located. When they reached the mouth of the creek, they found a squatter living in a log cabin on the east bank. This man's name was Walker, and was no doubt the first settler in Port Dover. They were very much surprised when they reached the lake, and after a conference with Walker, took a westerly course up the lake shore. When they reached the mouth of Big Creek, they wended their way up the cedar-entangled valley of that stream to a point some distance above the site of the present village of Delhi. Nothing they had seen pleased them as well as that little valley down which they had found their way to the lake. And so taking a southeasterly course, they struck their old trail and located their lands in what is now known as Lynn River Valley. They spent about 3 weeks in the forests of Norfolk, mostly, before they decided on a location. Unlike so many of our old Long Point pioneers, the Austins made a wise choice when they located their new homes. The natural surroundings of the old Austin homestead are picturesque, and the soil is exceedingly fertile. So they did a good choice in choosing where to homestead, apparently. Apparently, a lot of pioneers made mistakes, but they were very prudent. And yeah, so that's good for them. When Mr. Austin and his son returned to Newark, they found the family suffering with that pest of pioneer life, chill fever. This detained them a whole season in the Niagara settlement, and it was some time in 1794 before they were settled in Lynn Valley. They suffered, of course, the hardships and privations which fell to the lot of all the old pioneers. So next, the War of 1812. The War of 1812 broke in upon their work of home building, and Solomon Austin and his 4 stalwart sons marched out of the Little Valley to fight for the old flag in the defense of their new homes. They were at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, and before the war closed, it is said, each one of the sons had been promoted to the rank of captain. It is no wonder the Austins are noted for loyalty to country, fidelity to sound principles, and love of home. So I'm going to pause for a second and point out. So not only was he a veteran of the Revolution for the British, he and his sons fought in the War of 1812 for the British, and very heroically. His sons were made captain, including our ancestor, who I'll just show quick, if I can find it, was Jonathan Austin, who was one of those captains. So we have 2 ancestors who fought in the War of 1812 for the British, and they fought at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, which is also known as the Battle of Niagara. It is one of the bloodiest battles of the war, and one of the deadliest fought in Canada. And it was the battle that caused the Americans to retreat from Canada. Basically, the Canadians successfully defeated the American advance into Canada, and this is where they stopped the Americans from conquering Canada. So whether whatever else you want to say, that's pretty heroic to have fended off the marauding Americans at Niagara. And that's our family. So going back to it, the grand American ancestor of the family emigrated from the border of Wales about 175 years ago. So this is the first Austin. And settled on a little bay in the Patapsco River, which I probably pronounced wrong, about 12 miles above its entrance into the Chesapeake Bay in Baltimore County in the colony of Maryland. Here on the Austin estate was founded the city of Baltimore in 1729. So the Austin family's been there before the city of Baltimore. When the colonies threw off their allegiance, the Austins were wealthy and influential, as indeed were all the leading loyalists. But when the war was over, they were reduced to poverty and subjected to persecution. The overthrow and expulsion of the loyalist element proved an irreparable loss to the tone and moral worth of the colonies. Oh, wait, this is where it starts getting into some Canadian monologuing, which I do encourage you to read, but I'm not going to read as it's not, we'll say, biographically relevant. But it's very, just like Canada's great. Okay, so next. Solomon Austin had 4 sons, Solomon, Jonathan, who's our ancestor, Philip and Moses, and 5 daughters, Mary, Amy, Esther, Elizabeth, and Anna. And I'm going to skip all of their descendants except for our ancestor, Jonathan, just because. Jonathan Austin, second son of Solomon, married Hannah Potts. He had 2 sons, William and John, and 6 daughters, Charlotte, Mary, Joanna, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Rebecca Ann. He and his younger son built the mills in Lynn Valley, known as Austin Mills. So that's the mills that they were trying to get good water rights for, and they got them. 4 of his daughters, Charlotte, Joanna, who's our ancestor, Elizabeth and Rebecca Ann, married respectively John Wheeler, John Hines, Thomas M. England, and Robert Lane. So, and then there's a lot more after that, but I just want to include that part because that's our line. Okay, so jumping ahead. All right. So having described all of that, Solomon Austin and his pioneer wife, so we're back to our great ancestor who left North Carolina, both attained the age of 82. None of their sons reached so great an age except Philip, who reached his 87th year, being the last survivor of the family. Moses died comparatively young, being only about 55, while Solomon Jr. reached his 68th year. For several years previous to Philip's death, the members of his large family held a reunion on the anniversary of his birth. At the last of these reunions, there were present 137 descendants of Philip Austin, and the direct descendants of the original Solomon Austin numbered at this time, which is 1898, over 700. If this was the number 20 years ago, so 1878, what a mighty host they must be today. So there are a lot of descendants of Solomon Austin. That's the point. And he became a central figure in Ontario life because he was there early, very economically minded, built the community. Yeah, he was a figure. Okay, so now we are at the mystery. This is the part I was talking about. But according to a family tradition, the destiny that gave Norfolk this vigorous and most excellent element hung on a very slender thread at one time. It happened while Solomon Austin was fighting for British supremacy in America. As the story goes, he and 6 others were taken prisoners, and himself and another were condemned to death. Just before the time fixed for execution, Mr. Austin and another prisoner were permitted to go to a spring for a drink. They were accompanied by 2 guardsmen, and when they arrived at the spring, one of the guards handed his gun to the other guard and lay down to take the first drink himself. While thus engaged, the standing guard passed his comrade's gun over to Austin and gave him a wink to make good his escape. It was a narrow escape, but it proved successful. He knew the man who thus saved his life and had always looked upon him as a bitter enemy, but he never saw him afterwards and never knew what became of him. And that's it. Our great ancestor, Solomon Austin, was set to be executed by American revolutionaries during the Revolutionary War. And due to unclear reasons, he was allowed to escape by this person who apparently hated him, or at least was considered to hate him bitterly. And so it's left a mystery. What happened there? Why did it happen? How lucky it happened. As I said, I have my theories. I'm curious to hear what yours are. But because if it weren't for that mystery, it seems like none of us would be here. And with that, I'm going to close this chapter. I hope you found this interesting. And I look forward to hearing what you think. Thanks.